Could Ukraine be preparing to launch a nuclear bomb at Russia? That question might sound crazy due to Ukraine not being a nuclear-capable country, at least not right now. But imagine a world in which the United States pulls all of its financial support from Ukraine, leaving the country to face off against Russia on its own. No new weapons incoming. The weapons it does have are being lost to Russian missiles and drone strikes. What other option would Ukraine have? The crazy news is that Ukraine may well be capable of building its own nuclear weapons based on recent reports. And if it is, Ukraine may just have its last Hail Mary throw to launch at Russia waiting in the wings if the US pulls its support, or if everything else it tries to defeat Russia fails. That brings us to this video, where we answer a key question. Could Ukraine build a nuclear bomb if the United States decides to withdraw its support? Before digging into the answer to that question, we have another one to ask. Would Ukraine use a nuke if it had one? The simple answer, at least according to Ukraine, is a flat no. When reports first emerged that Ukraine may be capable of building its own nuclear weapon, the country's foreign ministry was quick to respond. The Kyiv Independent reported on the ministry's November 13th denial that it had any plans to build a nuclear weapon. Ministry spokesperson Hyori Tikyi took to X to post the following. Ukraine is committed to the NPT. We do not possess, develop, or intend to acquire nuclear weapons. He added that Ukraine works closely with the IAEA, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, and is fully transparent to its monitoring, which rules out the use of nuclear materials for military purposes. A flat refusal right off the bat from Ukraine. And in truth, this denial isn't surprising. Tikyi's mention of the NPT, or Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, is telling in this regard. Created in 1968, the NPT saw several nuclear and non-nuclear nations pledge their cooperation to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons technology. Ukraine is an NPT signatory, having joined it along with the former Soviet nations of Belarus and Kazakhstan in 1994. Interestingly, the NPT doesn't force any sanctions upon any nation that wishes to withdraw from it. Every signatory has the right to withdraw as part of exercising its national sovereignty, according to the US Department of State. However, withdrawing isn't a simple case of saying, we don't want to be part of the NPT anymore. There is a clause in the treaty that says any nation that wishes to withdraw is still held accountable for any violations of the NPT it conducted while still a signatory. Trying to build a nuclear weapon while still being part of the NPT would be a clear violation on Ukraine's part, and it choosing to withdraw from the treaty, even if it hasn't already started building a nuke, would be a clear signal of its intention to its partners. Ukraine would be telling the US and every other Western nation that's donated billions of dollars of weapons to its cause that it intends to plunge the world into nuclear war. That would only lead to those nations withdrawing their support and potentially viewing Ukraine as a threat. So there's practically no chance that Ukraine would violate the NPT and build a nuclear weapon of its own. It has far too much to lose. However, there is a potential addendum to throw into play here. When Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with US President-elect Donald Trump in September 2024, he supposedly told Trump that he believed Ukraine would need to have access to nuclear weapons. Those weapons would guarantee Ukraine's security, Zelensky allegedly claimed, perhaps allowing it to use the prospect of mutually assured destruction to stop Putin in his tracks. Those comments alone tell us that nuclear weapons are at least on the Ukrainian president's mind. However, The Times says that Zelensky made those comments in the context of Ukraine needing the weapons if it were prevented from joining NATO. Ukraine's president also walked back his comments later, telling the media that he'd meant to say that there was no alternative security guarantee to NATO membership, and that Ukraine categorically isn't considering nuclear rearmament. Still, the mention of not joining NATO is intriguing. Let's imagine for a moment that Zelensky begins to believe that he has no choice. Russia's constant bombardments have weakened his troops to the point where they can't hold out anymore. Worse yet, the United States has abandoned him. Peace talks with Russia, mediated by President Donald Trump, didn't work out, and the US decided it had done all that it could to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. As for NATO, it refuses Ukraine membership on the grounds that it doesn't want Ukraine to activate Article 5 of the NATO Charter and push all of its other members into a war with Russia. Left to stand alone in the face of such overwhelming odds, Zelensky may see nuclear weapons as his last resort. The question now is simple. With American support gone, no NATO membership, and with no regard for the NPT, could Ukraine actually build a nuclear weapon? It seems to be possible. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry's denial that it would ever build nuclear weapons may seem strangely specific. After all, this is a nation that has never once seemed to hold aspirations of becoming a nuclear power since it became a sovereign country. Its signing of the NPT demonstrates as much. showing that Ukraine wanted to remove all traces of the Soviet nuclear specter from its territory after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, the ministry is making those denials because reports have been published claiming that Ukraine has everything that it needs to build a nuke. The UK-based media outlet The Times was the first to make the claim. On November 14, 2024, it published a report on a briefing paper prepared for the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense by the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies. The center is one of Ukraine's top military think tanks. That paper presented some ideas for Ukraine's options should President-elect Donald Trump choose to withdraw US military assistance from the country. According to the briefing, Ukraine already has everything it needs within the country to build a basic nuclear device roughly equivalent to the Fat Man bomb that the US dropped on Nagasaki during World War II. That bomb, along with the Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima, was a war ender. Ukraine may hope that a similar bomb it develops could be the same. Specifically, The Times quotes the briefing as stating that creating a simple atomic bomb, as the United States did within the framework of the Manhattan Project, would not be a difficult task 80 years later. It's a task that would become possible because Ukraine is already a nuclear nation in many respects. It ranked 7th in the world for total installed nuclear capacity at 13 gigawatt electric units, which are equivalent to 1 billion watts each, back in 2020. The country has 15 nuclear reactors, most of them split between South Ukraine and Volnaya, along with 2 under construction. And those reactors produce a byproduct Ukraine could use to build its nukes, plutonium. The National Museum of the United States Air Force demonstrates why plutonium would be such a key ingredient in Ukraine's nuclear bomb. It describes the Fat Man as an implosion-type weapon using plutonium. America's early atomic weapon was made by creating a hollowed-out sphere of high explosive into which a subcritical sphere of plutonium was placed. The high explosive sphere had numerous detonators placed on its surface, all of which fired simultaneously to create enormous amounts of inward pressure on the capsule. The pressure created by these detonations squeezed to the point that the sphere's density increased, leading to the supercritical conditions needed to create a nuclear explosion. Ukraine has more than enough plutonium, according to The Times. Every spent fuel rod used in its nuclear reactors is a source, with that plutonium being the key to Ukraine building a nuclear weapon quickly. As the briefing The Times obtained notes, the weight of reactor plutonium available to Ukraine can be estimated at 7 tons. That's enough material for Ukraine to build hundreds of warheads with a tactical yield of several kilotons, claims the briefing. Using plutonium also allows the country to bypass the long-winded uranium enriching process. Iran Watch provides some details on that process. It says the uranium used for modern nuclear weapons typically has to be enriched to 90% in the isotope U-235. Lower grades of uranium take longer to enrich. The organization says Iran would need to build an enrichment plant containing around 3,000 centrifuges to enable it to enrich enough uranium to create one nuclear weapon in 4 months. Ukraine would face the same type of obstacle. In a situation where the United States has abandoned Ukraine, 4 months would simply be too much time. Plus, Ukraine would have to build the enrichment plant in the first place while it's being bombarded by Russia. So plutonium, to create a Fat Man equivalent, is the country's only route to developing a nuclear weapon quickly. The Times notes that there's another factor that plays in Ukraine's favor if it ever chooses to build a nuclear bomb. The country still contains a lot of nuclear expertise. We mentioned earlier that Ukraine became an NPT signatory in 1994 following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before that, the country was host to the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal under the Soviet Union's control because it provided Russia with the simplest path if it needed to launch against Europe. That nuclear arsenal was removed in 1996, 2 years after Ukraine became an NPT signatory, but many of the scientists who maintained Ukraine's old nukes remain. They understand how to build nuclear weapons, removing one of the key obstacles that would otherwise stand in Ukraine's way. Speed comes from this knowledge. Not needing to learn how to build a nuke would enable Ukraine to jump straight into the manufacturing process. But there are problems. Though the resulting nuclear weapon would be similar to Fat Man, it would fall short in terms of pure power. The briefing's authors believe a single one of the bombs Ukraine could make would offer up to about 1/10 of the power of a single Fat Man. That's a pretty severe limitation, considering Russia's nuclear weapons are practically all more powerful than America's revolutionary nuke. But even so, 1/10 of a Fat Man would still give Ukraine plenty of options. That would be enough to destroy an entire Russian airbase or concentrated military, industrial, or logistics installations, the briefing notes, while highlighting that the precise yield of each bomb would be unpredictable. It would all depend on the isotopes present in the waste plutonium Ukraine extracts from its nuclear power plants. The report adds that there are technological challenges. Ukraine would have to come up with a complicated conventional explosion design, similar to that seen in The Fat Man. Tough, perhaps, but doable, claims the briefing. Of course, being capable of building a rudimentary nuclear weapon and having the ability to do so legally are two very different things. Even if the United States abandons Ukraine so it's forced to fight Russia alone, Ukraine would still have to come up with some form of justification for its use of nuclear weapons. That would start with providing a good reason for its withdrawal from the NPT that Ukraine would hope ensures that the US and other nuclear powers don't start to think of it as an enemy. The Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies briefing has that angle covered too. According to the European Conservative, a portion of the briefing claims that Ukraine would have the legal justification to build nuclear weapons due to Russia violating the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. The memorandum was a joint pledge between the US, UK, and Russia to offer security assurances to Ukraine as it ascended to the status of signatory to the NPT. Each Budapest Memorandum signatory pledged that it would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and inviolability of its borders, and to refrain from the use or threat of military force, according to the Harvard Kennedy School. You can likely already guess where the briefing's legal justification comes from based on that description. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea was Russia's first violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Putin's launch of his special military operation was the second, with that particular violation still ongoing. The briefing's authors argue that the violation of the memorandum by the nuclear-armed Russian Federation provides formal grounds for withdrawal from the NPT and moral reasons for reconsideration of the non-nuclear choice made in early 1994. In other words, Ukraine made its non-nuclear decision in 1994 because it was assured that three of the major nuclear powers of the time would respect its territory. Russia has thrown that assurance back in Ukraine's face. It's trying to destroy the very concept of Ukraine as a sovereign territory. Given that situation, the briefing argues, Ukraine has every legal justification to exit the NPT due to promises made by Russia being broken. Ukraine would make that argument to the US and UK. It would hope that both would understand its reasoning and not object to its use of nuclear weapons on Russia. Desperation could push Ukraine into going down the nuclear route, according to Valentin Badrak, who directs the think tank that produced the briefing. He says that Ukraine faces an existential challenge in its war with Russia. This is both a fight for sovereign territory and the existence of the Ukrainian people, Badrak claims, as he believes that millions of Ukrainians would be killed under occupation. Badrak himself has experienced a taste of this. A native of the Irpin region, he witnessed occupying Russians torture and kill Ukrainian civilians during the early months of Putin's special military operation. Millions of Ukrainians would rather die than allow Russia to take over their home, he claims, which is why his think tank published its brief in the first place. By this point, it appears that Ukraine is capable of producing a primitive nuclear weapon should the United States abandon it to its fate against Russia. However, there are some caveats to consider. In its report on the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies briefing, The Times points out that many Western experts believe Ukraine is nowhere near building a nuke. Doing so would take at least 5 years, according to The Times, and Ukraine would have to build both a nuclear weapon and a suitable carrier for the warhead. Badrak refutes this. He claims that not only can Ukraine avoid this 5-year wait by using plutonium in its weapons rather than enriched uranium, but it's also close to building the required carriers. In 6 months, Ukraine will be able to show that it has a long-range ballistic missile capability. We will have missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers, approximately 621 miles, says Badrak. If that's true, then Ukraine would still have to wait for half a year before it could launch if the US abandons it. That's 6 months Russia could use to finally overrun an exhausted country that's no longer receiving weapons from its current allies. Even with its nukes, Ukraine would still lose because it has no way of getting them onto Russian territory without flying directly over it with bombers. Writing for the New Voice of Ukraine, Ukrainian political expert Alexei Koshul also takes issues with Badrak's briefing. He starts his piece by saying, "First of all, this is an extremely bad story for us. The very fact that such publications appeared." Koshul goes on to rubbish the document, saying that any think tank can come out with the types of information seen in the briefing the Times obtained. That wouldn't mean the information is accurate. Furthermore, Koshul says that there's no evidence that the briefing ever reached the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and if it did, that there's even less evidence to suggest that Zelensky's top military brass even considered it. So it's just an analytical note that could not have been submitted, that could have been sent by email, perhaps on behalf of somebody else, he claims. Reading between the lines, Koshul's message is clear. There's no real evidence that his country can produce nukes. Koshul then really digs into the briefing's legitimacy, claiming it has a tangible shade of artificiality. that only exists to create a sensation. He even insinuates that the briefing could damage Ukraine's relationship with its Western partners. The collective West is extremely vulnerable to such information, says Koshal, as he points to the many systems in place to prevent the proliferation of nuclear arms. If anything, the briefing may just feed into the false narrative Russia is creating that claims Ukraine has access to nuclear weapons. In a fact-checking piece related to the Times report, iNews says the Kremlin has made numerous claims that Ukraine is trying to build nuclear weapons. One such claim came in March 2022, a month after Putin launched his invasion, which said Ukraine was on its way to building a dirty bomb in Chernobyl using plutonium. iNews points out that the Russian media cited no sources to back up this claim, but the fact that something very similar is being suggested in a report created by a Ukrainian think tank may simply fuel Putin's propaganda machine and allow for the formation of anti-Ukraine sentiment. So there are clear doubts about the legitimacy of the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies claims. While the plutonium argument appears sound, as does the claim that Ukraine still has nuclear experts, the report may be ignoring some of the additional challenges that go into actually launching a nuclear weapon. Ukraine needs a carrier for any warhead it produces. It still doesn't have one that would enable it to fire a nuke from range to hit a Russian target. But perhaps more worrying is that the report also doesn't consider what may be the most important aspect of a Ukrainian decision to use nuclear weapons: the consequences. Zelensky is already well aware of the immediate consequence of a nuclear decision. In October 2024, Ukraine's president stood before the attendees of a European Council summit in Brussels and told them in plain terms, "It's nuclear or NATO. Either Ukraine will have nuclear weapons and that will be our protection, or we should have some sort of alliance," Zelensky claimed. Apart from NATO, today we do not have any effective alliances. Seemingly incendiary comments, but Zelensky followed them up by pointing out that NATO would be his choice every time. NATO countries are not at war. People are alive in NATO countries, and thank God. That's why we choose NATO, not nuclear weapons. Zelensky's problem is that NATO hasn't chosen him, at least not in the way it's chosen its member nations. Most of Ukraine's current support comes from countries that are NATO members, but Ukraine isn't a member itself, and it needs to do everything it can to show that it's not some wild card nation if it's to become a member in the future. Launching nukes at Russia would do Ukraine no favors. So if the country goes down that route, perhaps the biggest consequence it would face is that it would no longer have a chance of becoming part of the world's largest collaborative defense organization. And Zelensky knows this. During a press conference following the Brussels summit, he made it clear that Ukraine wasn't building nuclear weapons. "What I meant is that today there is no stronger security guarantee for us besides NATO membership," claimed Zelensky. Ukraine has to choose between nuclear and NATO. Right now, it's choosing NATO. But what if Zelensky's much-desired NATO membership never comes? With the US out of the picture in this scenario, he may feel that he's been pushed into using the nuclear weapons Ukraine can apparently develop. But therein lies another consequence. Russia's nuclear arsenal dwarfs anything that Ukraine could put together. The Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies report may claim that Ukraine has enough plutonium to build several hundred rudimentary nuclear bombs that each average out to about a tenth of the power of the Fat Man, but Russia's arsenal goes far beyond that. The Arms Control Association says that Russia has 5,580 nuclear warheads. Around 1,200 of those warheads have been retired, but as for the rest, 1,549 are strategically deployed and ready to launch whenever Putin wants. The remaining 4,380 are classified as part of Russia's military stockpile, meaning they include both active and inactive warheads that could be assigned for use on military delivery vehicles if needed. Bear in mind that Russia is also the country that created the Tsar Bomba, a devastating hydrogen bomb. The Tsar Bomba is the largest nuclear device ever detonated, and it had a yield of 50 megatons. The Fat Man had a yield of between 15 and 21 kilotons, meaning any nuke that Ukraine could build would offer a 1.5 to 2.1 kiloton yield. The differences in number and power are staggering. Ukraine could do some damage to Russia with its nuclear weapons, but it would be opening the door to Putin to respond in kind with far more powerful nukes that would flatten the country. Ukraine would never be able to survive its own nuclear strategy. The US and NATO would ostracize the nation if it went down that route, and Russia would destroy it. So, could Ukraine use nuclear weapons if the US abandoned it? Possibly. The Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies report claims that it has everything it needs to build some pretty powerful bombs. As for whether it should, Zelensky knows that NATO is far preferable to the nuclear option. Unleashing his country's mini Fat Man bombs would be a death sentence for all of Ukraine. But what do you think about Ukraine and its potential nuclear bombs? Does it really have the capacity to build them? And if it does, is there any chance it would use them, knowing what the consequences would be? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.